Good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to see you all here. I'm Andrew Jones. I'm the chair of the Center for Chinese Studies here at Berkeley, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this fourth Elvira Kwang-Siam Lim Memorial Lecture in Chinese Studies. And we're especially honored today to have Professor Wu Hong here to join us. I'll introduce him in a moment. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the history of this lecture series and the donor who allowed it to take place and to continue to take place year after year. This endowed lecture series was made possible through a generous gift to the Center for Chinese Studies by Mrs. Lim's family to honor her dedication to scholarly exchange. With this endowment, we bring one eminent scholar to Berkeley each fall semester to present a public lecture, meet with faculty and graduate students, and generally foster scholarly exchange and debate among colleagues. The namesake of the series, Elvira Kwang-Siam Lim, was born in Shantou, Guangdong Province in 1928. She was sent to Hong Kong to attend high school there and later received her undergraduate degree from the University of Hong Kong. After receiving her PhD from the University of Hawaii, Mrs. Lim herself took a position in the biology department of the newly established Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she remained until her retirement in 1989. She passed away in Oakland, California on March 27th, 2006. And again, the lecture is in her honor. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. This isn't an easy task. Professor Wu Hong is from the University of Chicago. We're very happy to welcome him back. I was just mentioning to him that we'd like to have him back at regular intervals. And many of you will know that he's one of the most, if not the most prominent figures in Chinese art history. He's the Harry A. Vandersteppen Distinguished Service Professor of Art History at Chicago. He's in the East Asian Languages and Civilizations Department. He's also the director of the Center for Art of East Asia at Chicago, and finally a consulting curator at the Smart Museum of Art. And as some of you also know, he's often a consulting curator for a number of other, many other exhibitions across the world, featuring modern, contemporary, as well as pre-modern Chinese art. Of course, then Wu Hong's specialty is early Chinese art, from the earliest years to the Cultural Revolution and beyond, into contemporary artistic production of all kinds. His special research interests include relationships between visual forms, such as architecture, bronze vessels, pictorial carvings, murals, photography, and ritual social memory and political discourses. There are too many books that he's produced to list here. I had a long list already, and he just handed me a note with the last three, The Harvest from 2010. So if we could all produce 3 books a year, we'd be very pleased. I guess he's slacking off, as Professor Petberger said just now, but I'll list some of them, or some of the most important publications. Going back in time, there was Remaking Beijing, Tiananmen Square, and the Creation of a Political Space. Monumentality in Early Chinese Art, that was from 1995. Transience, Chinese Experimental Art at the End of the 20th Century, from 1999. Those are some of the classics from the past. And I'll tell you about the most recent books from 2010. There are 2 edited volumes. One entitled Contemporary Chinese Art, Primary Documents. This is published by New York and the Museum of, in New York by the Museum of Modern Art. He also edited Reinventing the Past, Antiquarianism and Archaism in Chinese Art and Visual Culture. This is published in Chicago by Art Media. And finally, a single authored volume entitled The Art of the Yellow Springs, Understanding Chinese Tombs, published in London and Hawaii. So that's quite a lineup. For today, we're also equally honored to have as our discussant Professor Pat Berger from our own Department of Art History, who will need no introduction around here, but it's really a pleasure to be able to welcome both speakers to today's lecture. So without further ado, I'll hand over the podium to Professor Wu Hong. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank everyone for coming to this lecture. I'm very happy to return to Berkeley. Just so many old friends and just very nice to come back to talk about some new works, because here the people just can give me a lot of insights, a lot of comments. Today, I also hope it's a new work, you will see. So I really hope to receive your questions, comments, starting from Pat, maybe, then with others. I want to first say that although the topic is about early photography, but I do not consider myself a professional historian of early photography. But I do like to go to museums, to archives, to libraries, to auction house, to private collectors, to see old photos. It's just very interesting. Have been for years. And sometimes I do some research. Actually, I gave a talk years ago here, was also about photography. I think there's a tool, then I thought about it, where this interest come from. So I think there's at least two things. One is that I'm interested in the meeting and either positively and negatively is misunderstanding, understanding, tension between different peoples, different nations, different cultures from ancient time to this day. So during the 19th century, early 20th century, photography was introduced to China. It's really, I believe, changed the Chinese way of seeing themselves and seeing the world. So that was a major change. So that's one source. Another interest of mine is that about studying Chinese art in a global context. So Chinese art history, basically, as you know, have been basically constructed within as a kind of national art history, Chinese art from like Shang Dynasty all the way to modern. But in actuality, Chinese have been always contacting with other people. Information has been flow from ancient time to this day. And photography, again, I feel it was wonderful. Represents one wonderful new moment when a new technology was introduced to China, actually was immediately used by Chinese. So create many new situations. So that's some larger issues. So although today's talk is really a very specific case study, but probably you can hear the echoes of those larger issues, I hope. Yeah. So let me begin. Among the Western photographers working in China in the second half of 19th century, Milton Miller, is best known for his portraits of Chinese officials, businessmen, and women. He actually arrived in Hong Kong and briefly went to Guangzhou in 1860 from San Francisco, from here. And left China in 1963 and returned to Maine and just died there. So he stayed in China for 2 to 3 years. To many collectors and researchers, let me see, should I get a photograph? That's him, a young man. To many collectors and researchers, these pictures by him are prized artistic images which not only demonstrates the photographer's technical sophistication, but also, yes, you can see here two pictures. Not only technically very sophisticated, but also reveals the sitter's inner character, a combination rarely seen in early photography of China. For example, Terry Bennett recently states in a book called History of Photography in China, a very useful, well-researched book. He writes, I quote, Milton Miller was arguably the best portrait photographer in 19th century China. His subjects are never stilted, and he tried to tease out the personality of each sitter, often succeeding with such intense immediacy that for a moment or two, the intervening 150 years melt away, leaving us feeling wholly engaged but slightly unnerved. That's from Bennett. So take one picture, this portrait of an old woman as the example. As you can see, she wears an elaborate embroidered robe with matching vest and skirt, the ceremonial garb of a Qing official's wife. Though expressionless, her wrinkled face shows signs of a long, unhappy life. I think pretty obvious. Delicately contrasting with her ornate crown of jewels and flowers. The image is subtle yet direct. Its directness is reinforced by light, which comes from above and focuses on the woman's body and face, foregrounding her from the shadowing surroundings. The sense of visual immediacy and the woman's individualized appearance reconfirm the picture's identity as a portrait, and explain why these and similar images by Miller have been praised as, I quote, the most significant body of 19th century Chinese official portraits. You have to realize in 1860s, it's not very usual to have this kind of image for a single person, especially from China. But who is this woman? Is she really the wife of Tatar general, as a version of the picture's English caption says? Who is this Tatar general? Why did she appear in Miller's studio to have a formal visage taken? These questions have never been asked because people are willingly trusted the image to be a genuine portrait, mainly based on its heightened naturalistic effect. But during a workshop held at the Getty Research Institute in 2006, actually several people from Berkeley also participated, like Professor Invention, William Schaefer, they were both there. During the workshop, we studied many old photos, including quite a few photographs by Miller. This particular image was scrutinized along with some other Miller pictures. Certain peculiar features of these photographs were recognized. One problem concerns the old lady's clothes, which actually are worn by different women in other Miller pictures. For example, including this young lady, this young lady to the right. Later we'll see a picture, somehow it's missing. She also wears the same clothes of this woman. So raise the questions about the nature of these pictures. So this, I then began, after the workshop, I began to poke around and to do more research. So this paper is really resulted from this work. So the first question, who is the sitter? Who is the sitter? Taking this initial discovery about the clothes as a clue, I have tried to trace the links between Miller's Chinese portraits by comparing their subjects, costumes, settings, and the props. Many more connections can be established. The young woman is shown both here. Yes, actually this picture showed before. You can see, yes, we found actually these two subjects, one old woman, one woman, but if you compare their clothes, are entirely identical, from the crown down to the shoes, exactly the same, okay? So starting from here as a clue, I did a lot of detective work, and more connections can be established. The young woman is shown both individually and with her husband. The husband is also photographed with his mother and younger brother. That is this one. The husband is here. He reappears here, then with the mother and younger brother. The mother, who turns out to be none other than the wife of the Tatar general. I think, yes, basically, yes. And she appears with other women in yet another picture. So she also appears here with 4 other women. So you see, just again, there are more and more pictures. They are actually interconnected. So this detective work has finally singled out at least 11 photographs as belonging to a tight feature-sharing cluster. The same people appear and reappear in these pictures in different costumes and changing groups. And the portraits were all shot in the same place and with an identical photographic style. Their iconographical consistency and stylistic coherence suggests a loosely defined, I call it, a project. It is possible that Miller created these images during his short stay in Guangzhou in 1861. We have documents to prove that he actually temporarily established a studio in Guangzhou, but there was theft, then he left. So he stayed there shortly in 1961. Before contemplating the implications of these findings, however, we need to look more closely at these images. I should warn you that this paper is very detailed, maybe even too detailed, but I will explain why I have to do this. So let's look at these pictures more closely. First, we're starting from a single person. The most frequently photographed and also the most probably photogenic sitter among Miller's subjects is this young man. I think he's here, right, this young man. In the first picture you see here, he wears a winter-style official surcoat called the bufu in Qing Dynasty. The bird insignia in the square badge on his chest identifies him as a civil official. There is a badge, if you can see, maybe not that clear. So basically, officials all wear a badge, and there's a bird there. And the different birds identify the different official ranks. So this particular bird, I'm sorry, maybe, okay, this is better, you can see, identifies him as a civil official. During the Qing, there were 9 degrees of civil officials whose different ranks were indicated by the various bird motifs on their badges. In the present case, the bird is probably the silver pheasant called the Bai Xian. That's this one. The symbol of the 5th degree civil official. The same man appeared in this picture, next picture, with his wife. Here he has changed into a summer-style surcoat made of a semi-translucent gauze. So this is, you can see, that's a fur hat, that's different. That's for winter, you have a fur color, this for summer. If you have a real photograph, you can see very clearly these clothes are almost semi-translucent. The bird insignia in the second picture differs from the first one and indicates a different official rank. The same one also appears in 2 other pictures in casual domestic clothes. In one picture, he sits with his wife and their 4 children. That's to your right. In the other, he's with his aged mother, a younger man who should be his younger brother, and 3 children. But it seems that only 2 children in the second picture are his. According to traditional Chinese custom, the boy sitting next to the younger brother should be the latter son. So here, basically, that's his children, that's younger brother's children. But in this picture, it's a family with 4 children. The young wife, now we shift to the young wife here. She's a very beautiful woman, young wife. Portrayed in this picture to your right also appears in multiple pictures. In this picture, he wears a full set of the ceremonial attire of an official principal wife, including an embroidered robe with official insignia and a matching skirt, a jeweled crown, and a long necklace. During the Qing, a lady put on such a formal costume only on ceremonial occasions. But the woman in figure, this picture sits in a rather languid pose, which seems at odds with her supposed social status and the implied formal occasion. Leaning to one side, she puts an arm on a chaji, that's traditional style tea table. So it's, one arm is put on this little table, while exposing her tiny bound feet. It's also quite unusual. Next one shows her again, presents an even bigger problem. Here she is dressed in a Han style, unofficial jacket and skirt, but with a rank badge on the chest. Not only is it highly unusual to combine a rank badge with an informal jacket, but the badge also differs from the one in the previous prints. So this badge, if you compare carefully, is different from the badge here. I consulted some experts of textile and costumes. They told me they also found this jacket is very peculiar because the badge somehow covered with, put in the middle. You have actually these decorative borders. Somehow this badge is just put in front of this border. They found it's rather strange. The young man, we talk about this young man here. The young man's clothes, both his winter-style surcoat, fur hat and collar, and his summer-style surcoat with a different rank badge, are shared by a middle-aged man in the lower pictures. This older man, in the last picture, this older man is accompanied by his wife. Her clothes are completely identical with those worn by the young woman in the previous pictures. So now we found the third woman wearing the same set of clothes. So like the young couple, this middle-aged couple is also portrayed with other family members in plain clothes. Actually, there are some boys are interchangeable with this family. So similarly, there are a lot of this detective work getting more interesting. Similarly, the young man's aged mother, if now we shift to the mother, this old woman, reappears in the picture discussed at the beginning of this paper, in which she has changed her plain robe to ceremonial garb. Upon close comparison, we find that she and the two women in the other pictures, these 3 women, I just mentioned, all wear the same set of clothes and ornaments, including not only the robe, skirts, the crown, and the necklace. Moreover, her identity as the wife of the Tatar general Kantong cannot be true because, let's go back, that's too many pictures. Because in other pictures, she and her children all wear typical Han clothes. One of these Chinese images of this old lady is seen, let me see, I'm sorry. I don't want to confuse you. It's seen here. That's Chinese clothes. Is seen in the middle one. So if she's the wife of a Tatar general here, it's very unlikely she can be a Chinese grandma in that picture. So let's return to these 11 pictures. If we study their settings, we find that they were all shot in the same space, as indicated by the identical diamond pattern on the carpet and the same plan backdrop. They also employ identical props, including 2 side tables, one Chinese style and the other Western style, a set of covered teacups, and 2 sets of chairs. So if you can see, these basically the teacup, the carpet, and there are actually there is a Western style also appears here. So basically there are 2 tables, same carpets, the same kind of props used together. In 2 cases, additional props such as the potted flowers, the calligraphic scrolls, and the table screen are employed to generate a stronger domestic atmosphere. This one have more stuffs in it. This space, then where is this space? I think it's clearly Miller's studio in Guangzhou, because the studio at the time, usually you have this kind of wall-to-wall carpet, a very large carpet. You have to have a special window to create a kind of lighting, so, and with certain kinds of furniture props. So clearly Miller's studio. So why should we conduct such a close reading, which seems to focus primarily on the sitters' clothes, ornaments, and the rank badges seems very trivial? The answer is such examination, to me, marks the beginning of a serious inquiry into the nature of these historical photographs. Any historical inquiry requires an evidential base. Due to the paucity of archival evidence in studying early photographic pictures in China, this basis can be established only through a systematical inventory and analysis of the intrinsic properties of actual photographs. Here I just want to say why I do that, because that is the methodology. We don't have textual evidence, documents about the creation of these pictures. We have no records about Miller Studio. We have no idea who these persons are. So all this information we have to tease out from the pictures themselves. So that's my suggestion. We have to start from this close reading. I will do more, in fact. Such preliminary examinations is both deconstructive and constructive, because it simultaneously frees a photograph from unsubstantiated assumptions and reestablish its status as a historical image and artifacts. Because we have a lot of captions, we have a lot of assumptions, we have been calling them portraits. So these are all, I don't think they are very solid conclusions. So I feel these kind of examinations somehow free these pictures from these assumptions and return them to some just basic images. Then we can see them anew. In the present case of the 11 Miller portraits, it has now become obvious, I hope, to you, that we can no longer trust the conventional identification of the sitters. The labels of the pictures, for example, identify the young man variously as a Cantonese Mandarin, a minor official, or a Chinese merchant, basically all in English. So he has already multiple identifications. And the young woman we just saw is said to be the wife of the Mandarin, or merchant wife, when she is dressed in domestic clothes and is labeled as, in one version, the #1 wife of the Canton governor, or the wife of the lower official when she wears ceremonial costumes. As for the old lady we already know that some books introduce her as the wife of the Tartar general in Canton, but she is also identified in one book, quite influential, called The Face of China, as probably the wife of Guangzan Tang, governor of Canton, so very specific. But in another book, this time in Imperial China, as the wife of a Cantonese Mandarin on the cover. Actually, she's on the cover of Imperial China. And Terry Bennett identified her as a Mandarin wife simply in his new book. So again, each person has these multiple captions. None of these claims can be substantiated by textual evidence, but all of them can easily be refuted by the pictures themselves. As mentioned above, no official could have a different rank badges on winter and summer clothes at a given moment. And it is unthinkable that the ranking officials and their ladies would exchange clothes when they had formal portraits taken in a foreigner's studio. It is clear that these are all staged costume portraits with dubious historical credibility. But the labels and captions provide them with a fictional documentary quality. So now I move to my next question. Whose individuality? But it looks very individual-like. So whose individuality? The naturalistic style of these photographs place Miller among mainstream American portrait photographers of the 1950s, 1960s. Actually, this part, because we don't have a lot of time, I really basically cut quite a lot. This part, I basically try to study Milton Miller's background back in America. Actually, we found some historical information. He finally moved to San Francisco and became quite a prominent studio photographer, working in a major photo studio here. There's an advertisement that just to say how advanced the technology and style that particular studio use. So he's a known figure. I still try to find more. I'm asking my colleagues in American photography to see if we can find some archive of Miller's works here so we can make more comparisons. But at this moment, I don't have the works he created here, but we do have information. So the naturalistic style of the photographs we have seen place Miller among mainstream American portrait photographers of the 1850s and the 1860s. As historians of photography have shown, during this period, an ideal photographic portrait was conceptualized in America as a lifelike image emanating from the sitter's inner character. So inner character was considered very, very important, which enliven image. A representation of this kind must therefore treat, I quote, the exterior surface of persons as signs or expressions of inner truth, of interior reality. So that is the definition of a good portrait. Serving a well-to-do clientele obsessed with this so-called character, the task of a portrait photographer became predominantly, I quote again, how to achieve this character, how to show it and preserve it, and most of all, how to recognize this character in the sitter, end quote. Furthermore, to recognize and represent the sitter's character not only fulfills the mimetic function of photography, but more important, demonstrates the photographer's artistic aspiration and talent. So there's writing about if a photography was art or not. So major definition is really if this photographer just capture this surface, just then he's a technician, he's a craftsman. But if this person, like Bradley there, can really capture the inner spirit, then he rises to the rank of artist. So again, this character or the sitter's personality identify the photographer, the social artistic standing. So understood in this context, the heightened individuality in Miller's Chinese portrait, like all of these, each one is very individualized. The heightened individuality in Miller's Chinese portrait demonstrated the photographer's qualification as a creative artist, not necessarily the subjectivity of the sitter, especially when the sitter was a hired model. It is also important to recognize that although Miller was now working in a British colony away from home, his clients remained Westerners, not the local people. Indeed, even though the figures in his pictures appear to be men and women of distinct physical features and personalities, Miller never noted down their names and merely assigned them some genetic identities in English. Projecting an individualistic air, but remaining anonymous, these images represent a curious fusion of the newly emerging artistic genre of portrait photography and the age-old European tradition of depicting Chinese types and costumes. The puppet-like figures by William Alexander in Costume of China, that's late 18th century, early 20th century, about 60 years earlier than Miller, were turned into real, albeit still nameless, portrait. What this transformation signified, however, was not the self-discovery of an indigenous people, but the global reach of Western science and art and technology, which allowed a Western observer not only to record local costumes and customs, but also to transform the local into individuals in order to demonstrate his own modernity. That is strong conclusion, but we can discuss that. I feel it's this type of portrait actually is a sort of demonstrate the photographer's invention, individuality, rather the sitter remain actually is anonymous. So let's move to the next topic called reinventing a Chinese portrait style. When Miller arrived in Hong Kong in 1860, the place was already populated by photo studios operated by Westerners and Chinese alike. The emergence and the proliferation of commercial studios is a main issue in the history of Chinese photography. Significantly, around this time, from the 1860s to 1870s, the Chinese peculiarity in portrait taking also became a recurrent topic of radical in Western accounts. That's a very interesting coincidence. Just we see the picture, we see actually the Chinese label, English label, that's along the Victoria Avenue. There were many studios, both Western and Chinese. So definitely the business was pretty good. But at the same time, you check newspapers and report, you find that there's somehow a caricature of the Chinese photographer. So it's quite an interesting phenomenon at that time. So according to this view, this Chinese peculiarity in portrait taking include these features. For example, a local sitter always demands a full front view with both ears showing. They say the Chinese have to have both ears showing. 1 ear, that's not Chinese. So that's one view. And Chinese always look straight into the camera lens in a very confrontational manner. That's another one. And Chinese always sit squarely next to a side table with artificial flowers on it. Always hates shadows on their face. Always wears his best clothes and holds favorite objects such as fan or snuff bottle, and always displays his non-nailed fingers distinctly, according to this report. Most of these oddities were reconfirmed by John Thompson in a report entitled Hong Kong Photographers. You know, John Thompson is a very famous, major figure, not in the photography of China, but in early photography in general. So he wrote an article called Hong Kong Photographers in 1970s. He confirmed this view because also he published this report in a very important journal called the British Journal of Photography back in London. So basically it turned these hearsay rumors into a kind of official report. But Thompson's report differs from other accounts in its inclusion of an interview with a fictive native practitioner named Hong, thus equating a Chinese photographer's professional standards with a Chinese sitter's uneducated preferences. So if a lot of accounts really talk about Chinese sitter's preference, Thompson here actually is saying that's a photographer's preference. So because he can interview this Hong. Hong told him that I would do this, I would do that. So there's an interesting shift. To drive his point home further, Thompson also illustrated the report with a drawing, actually a caricature. You can see that's Thompson's caricature. In describing this illustration, Rebecca Wu wrote in a very good article. She said, the dead full front orientation of the sitter, the painfully unnatural symmetry of his frog-like pose, and the tediously precise positioning of the furniture and prop all illustrate and parody the artificial regularity and the lack of depth condemned in Thompson's account. So, written in tones ranging from condescending to patronizing, accounts of this kind were nevertheless taken as reality. What makes this report especially persuasive is, I believe, what I called a discursive symmetry. Just basically between East-West, there appeared this discursive symmetry. Actually, these accounts were accepted not just by foreigners, but Chinese themselves, actually by our historians. Often we say that's the Chinese way, I wouldn't do that. But actually, I think it's highly questionable. There's a discursive symmetry because the picture they paint, this account paint, neatly contradicts Western conventions in portrait taking, hence confirming some deeply held notion about essential cultural difference between East and West. developed around the mid-19th century and applied to both operators and sitters, Western conventions were also concerned with how to arrange the body, where to allow the light to fall, what background and furniture to provide, and what to do with sitters' hands and legs and eyes. One such instruction from America reads, I read to you, the posture of the person sitting for the portrait should be easy and unconstrained. The feet and hands neither project too much nor drawn too far apart. The eye should be directed a little sideways above the camera and fixed upon some objects there, but never upon the camera. So you read this, you find actually that kind of description of the Chinese peculiarity is totally a mirror image of this. If the light should be this, then light is that. The body in Western picture should be size, then in Chinese picture totally frontal. So there is an interesting symmetry. So we moved, really we talk about kinds of discourse, kinds of construction of these visions, habits, cultural customs. Thompson's report and similar eyewitness accounts by Western informants have stimulated a scholarly interest in defining a distinct Chinese portrait style. But as some scholars like René Terrier summarized, after having scrutinized, studied hundreds of old portraits from the 19th and early 20th centuries, generally speaking, there are no radical difference between portraits of Chinese Western studios. Backtrack a little bit. This is return to my earlier say this discursive symmetry. If in Western portrait we emphasize this kind of naturalism, this kind of relaxed posture, then in the description of the Chinese scene is totally find the reversed image. Okay. So you see this, there's no evidence, basically, early Chinese photographers invented or favored this. This is picture basically from 1860s. Here are two pictures by two very early Chinese photographers, one called Lai Chung and Lai Afeng. He's very famous, very productive. You can see the hand gesture. That's exactly the same, exactly the same. It's very relaxed. It's quite different from the Miller portrait. So I think this René Terrier and other scholars' observation is correct. Generally speaking, it's very hard to find the photographer's identity from the pictures. Very hard to say. This picture is like this because the photographer is Chinese. In this case, you cannot tell. You cannot tell. So there is no strict line between the Western studio and Chinese studio, portrait studio. Chinese studios adopted various Western formulas in setting up the background and arranging sitters' poses, whereas many works by Western photographers nicely fit the aforementioned so-called Chinese conventions. Terrier's observation is supported by other scholars. So rather than conforming to the sharp culture divide repeated in the Western accounts, the empirical study of primary data, these photographs, reveal instead an abrupt split between practice and theory and discourse. So you study all these photographs, in actuality you cannot separate. What you find is a really sharp split. In practice, it's all mixed. But in theory, it's totally separated. So that is something coming out from here. So it's like in practice, Chinese photographs did this, but in the account, become caricature like that. So this split between practice and discourse lead us to think about the nature of Western accounts of Chinese portrait photography and the complexity of studio practices. In other words, we no longer frame our inquiry around what separates Chinese and Western studios, or whether Chinese sitters and photographers developed distinct standards in taking portrait. Of course, indigenous traditions of portraiture existed in pre-modern China and would influence people's attitude towards the camera. There's no question about it. But instead, our questions are refocused on a different issue, on a self-conscious construction of an authentic Chinese portrait style in photography. That's the issue I want to discuss. A construction which took place basically from the mid-19th century to early 20th century. Just a construction of what is authentic Chinese portrait style became really an issue. To my knowledge, during this period, no Chinese writer or photographer wrote about this style and the related practice. The so-called Chinese conventions of portrait photography were exclusively reported by Western observers, although sometimes citing local informants, in contrast to the contemporary European-American idea of portrait photography. Nor did Chinese writers and photographers comment on the uniqueness of the Western portrait style, an absence of interest which signifies the lack of a comparative approach. I haven't found, and you check out this historic history of photographies, no one cited really like Chinese writers talk about, oh, how strange is this Western photography. So no, they didn't say that. Actually, they embraced it. So for them, for the Chinese side, there was no this comparative approach. But this approach very strong from the other side. So there is also asymmetry there. So in contrast, the Western discourse on the Chinese portrait style was entirely based on a comparative approach, which was internalized by Miller in his studio practice. While following the Western canon to make images for foreign and some Chinese subjects, he also made the earliest set of portraits which began to define a distinct Chinese portrait style. So here we return to the 11 portrait with a renewed interest. The subject of the examination shifts from the sitters' clothes, costumes, ornaments, and insignia to their poses, gestures, props, and grouping. Underlying this shift is the changing focus from the sitter's identity to the modes of representation. So we are not talking about who are these people, but rather how to represent these people. It's modes of representation. Among the 11 images, 5 images portray individual sitters and 6 group portraits. My discussion will focus on the single-sitter pictures because just too many. So I will basically focus on those single-sitter. There's 5 of them. 4 of these 5 images conform to a standard composition, with a man or woman placed in the exact center of the picture, sitting in a perfect frontal pose and looking straight into the camera. Seemingly frozen in silent stillness, the static images betray no bodily movement or any sign of animation. And their rigidity is reinforced by the frontal arrangement of the chair and side table. The notion of space is reduced to a minimum. A picture appears flat, even if the sitter's face and robe are given a sculptured 3D quality. we have no difficulty to identify the origin of this compositional style. If Miller's treatment of the face and body follow a popular Western style, he designed the composition to echo a traditional Chinese ancestral portrait. If we put a contemporary ancestral portrait here, next to the four images, we see the same frontal posture, same direct look, same empty background, same spatial reduction, and enhanced two-dimensionality, and the same feeling of stillness and the lack of animation. Several additional factors further suggest that in making these images, Miller may have intentionally imitated ancestral portraits, a contemporary visual tradition in 19th century China. I want to emphasize, actually, these 5 pictures are contemporary. This one is, from a Freer gallery, and is exactly like a mid-19th century, and made for commercial purpose, not a real person. So what are these factors? I just give you very briefly, because each factor can spend more time to discuss them. First, like ancestral portrait, these photographic images show full-bodied figures dressed in official garb. Even the woman, you see down there, is given official badge. That's one. This official nature. Second, several details of Miller's portrait, such as the hand lightly holding a long necklace, like here, basically, the hand is always touch necklace. You can see exactly here, holding the necklace. Those are details. And the symmetrical placement of the 2 feet, like this kind of placement, like here is squarely, like a place 2 feet, and the use of a broad footstool, like you always have a footstool. So you have these details really match each other. So all found in ancestral portrait. Third, the 2 male figures that's on top, photographs, almost fill the entire picture frame. So you see their head is really tight. Here is different. This is very, very full, this composition. This composition is rarely seen in portrait photography. If you check like Western portrait photography and others, you don't see it is so full, but often you see in ancestral portrait, just 顶天立地, the head very close to the upper edge and the foot close to the bottom edge. Not everyone, but we do see some like that. There's a fourth, another point. Around the same time, or slightly later, fake ancestral portraits were made for commercial purposes and exported to foreign countries. Actually, now you can see in Western antique market, when you go to Peabody Museum in Salem, you see a lot of these kind of fake ancestral portrait. So you can imagine at the time the Westerner traveled to Hong Kong, other these ports, treaty ports, you could buy their portrait painted. You could also buy photographic portraits in a very similar style around that time. Fifth, as exemplified by these 2 portraits, surviving works by Chinese photographers such as Lai Chung closely follow prevailing Western styles and betray little direct influence of Chinese ancestral portrait. So that's just a hypothesis. Who was the first person really use ancestral portrait as a model? And now my data shows Miller was the earliest person, 1860, 1861. Like the Lai Chong, even later, Lai Afang, they still use a lot of this. So that's still, we may find other evidence, but based on the evidence I have, is quite different. Finally, a comparison between these 4 images with other portrait by the same photographer, Milton Miller, reveal a deliberate effort to create a typical Chinese portrait style. The sitter in these other portraits include both foreigners and Chinese, whose identity is often more definitely recorded. So here we can see a certain J.H. Chevchin sits in a relaxed posture with hat in hand. That's the top one on the corner. In outlandish, the diagonal balustrade and vertical column define an architecture space for him. So you have a very clear 3D-dimensional architecture space. It's not just an empty background. That's by Miller as well, around the same time. And here we see this picture. This is General Sir John Michel. He is actually the guy who leads the army, burned the Yuanmingyuan Garden. And the posture is almost like opposite of it. You see this outlandish manner. He stretched his booted feet almost outside the frame. You see the entire, just the profile is not the front. So these examples may make it clear that Miller had a wide range of compositional possibilities at his disposal. And in creating portraits for different subject or purpose, he made deliberate choices in the setting, gesture, and the spatial arrangements. I should say that actually Miller made a lot of other pictures for the Chinese subjects. He used other styles, not so rigid. So we see some picture probably he made in Shanghai. It's more lyrical, more relaxed, sometimes even interactions, sometimes even mild, some theatrical narrative event. So he had quite a few different stylistic models. But here, this group, I feel, is really demonstrate an effort to really define a typical Chinese portrait style. And when we turn to the last of these 5 pictures, we also find this choice. This last picture, unlike the 4 frontal visages, here the woman leans on one side and looks downward. The photographer has abandoned the frontal mode and has taken the picture from an oblique angle. We wonder why, in taking this portrait, Miller steered away from the ancestor portrait model. A possible answer is that the asymmetrical composition in this picture reinforces the woman's languid manner and the melancholy mood, which is taken as the purpose of this particular picture. So you can see here, Miller took more than one shot of the scene. Comparing the 2 existing versions, maybe more, we find that they differ slightly in the angle of the body and face. It is as if the photographer tried to find an ideal vantage point from which he could most effectively capture the heightened femininity of Chinese beauty. It's definitely featured as a Chinese beauty, just a very melancholy, very languid, slightly different. Like this face is more 3-quarter view, this lean to other side, the body slightly different. Simulating ancestral portrait, the frontal image have a different objective in forging an essential, timeless Chinese portrait style. Again, it should be emphasized that the presumed clients of these works were Westerners in China or back home, whose interest in purchasing a Chinese image lay fundamentally in its exotic otherness. as a visual testimony of alien culture and mentality. By employing hired models, Miller could construct such images with ease. He could order them to put on different costumes and ornaments, to move this or other way, and to form different groups. For the same Western audience, however, he also hoped to demonstrate his artistic sensibility by representing the seater's so-called character, a sensibility which would separate him from an old-fashioned illustrator of Oriental people and costumes. The combined outcome of these two desires conforms to neither Chinese nor Western aesthetics in their own terms, but mingles local visual forms, Western expectations, and the photographer's personal ambitions in a hybrid form. As we will see, this form would be further articulated and abstracted into a stereotype. But even in 1961, the two most dominant features of the four Miller portraits, Chinese sitters represented in the manner of an ancestral portrait, clearly separated them from other types of portraiture, advertising themselves as authentic Chinese images in both subject matter and style. The last one is basically a summary, the Chinese portrait style as a stereotype. Miller didn't invent this style, but only reinvented a local visual tradition to create a quintessential Chinese image for a global audience. His effort was joined by local studios. So I want to emphasize that. I don't want to put this East-West in this corner, just that's Westerner. Actually, I think almost immediately, this kind of effort was joined by local studios who learned their trade from the Western associates, and their advertisement explicitly emphasized such connections with the Western studios to propagate the authenticity of their product. So for the Chinese studio, there's a different notion of authenticity. They have to say, we learned this from this foreign so-and-so, therefore our art is authentic. So there is another way, move back. So in this political, we have to recognize that's mainly in treaty port in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Canton. In this political and economical environment, it is only natural that these Chinese studios would participate in the colonial construction of a typical Chinese portrait style, and even claim this style as their own. Moreover, because this style actually derives its source material from local culture, this reverse transmission into local culture was smooth and almost invisible. Further adjustments were made during this process of a reclamation. New props were added, changing style or clothes indicate shifting fashion, and heavy-handed foreign reference were neutralized. This adjustment or reappropriation of an already appropriate indigenous visual tradition concealed the colonial intent in the initial construction of the style, translating a Western fetish into Chinese self-imagination. By 1872, when Thompson wrote his report in the British Journal of Photography, the process of this transformation or counter-transformation or reclamation had been largely completed. The fictive Hong Kong photographer Ah Hong could now give him a whole lecture on the Chinese portrait style. And another British photographer, D.K. Griffith, could also thoroughly attribute this style to Chinese sitters' choice in Shanghai. These accounts, which had become self-evident almost in 1870s, signal a further transformation of the Chinese portrait style into what we call a stereotype, not only in visual representation, but also in verbal discourse and perception. Three operations made this counter-transformation possible, actually the third transformation possible, including a complete, called a fixity, actually Homi Bhabha's word, fixity or fixed perception of a typical Chinese subject, a deepening concealment of the Western participation in the style's construction, and the forced divorce between the style and the concept of art. Thompson's report and the accompanying diagram, let's see, show here, sufficiently demonstrate these operations, three operations. So I read a little paragraph from Thompson's report. He wrote, they, meaning Chinese portraits, were all taken in the same pose, seated at a very square table. Basically, it's explaining this caricature, or rather a table that looks like a number of carefully constructed skeletons of cubes placed on one above the other. On the table, there is a vase containing artificial flowers, gaudy caricatures of nature. The background of plain clothes is adorned with two curtains arranged to form a triangle. And the sitter is posed as if his figure were intended to demonstrate a proportion of Euclid, just a very geometric. In this kind of characterization, the Chinese portrait style implies rigidity and an unchanging order, reinforced by countless repetitions. Works of this kind deny gentle contours, spontaneous movement, or romantic atmosphere, but only show unfitting geometric shapes arranged in a cold symmetry. Envisioned as a natural outcome of the local mentality, this style is now defined as a purely Chinese, freed from any of the cultural ambiguity or stylistic hybridity that once characterized Miller's Chinese portraits. So I feel from 60 to 70, there is a shift. Miller's portrait, say the face, the body, still there is a contradiction. There is a clear hybridity working towards for different taste. But by the 70s, Thompson, this ambiguity already disappeared. It's a purely Chinese. It's a symptom of the culture. Thompson specified a strange, very square table. But actually, I just want to say a little bit, just that this construct is largely fictional. For example, Thompson entirely omitted the role of Western photographers in the construction of style. For example, he mentioned this strange, very square table next to a Chinese sitter as the principal feature of the standard Chinese portrait. So he mentioned several times, so basically this table as a principal feature. But we have seen that this table is in fact a permanent fixture of Miller's studio and appeared in 7 of the 11 pictures studied in my talk. So it's really, if you say who used this table first, it's really a question. Finally, in Thompson's aesthetic judgment, such unchanging formulaic images cannot be called art. And this explains why he represents this particular style with a drawing rather than photograph. And drawing is really show the gaudy artificial flowers on the table and this very unnatural posture. Homi Bhabha described stereotyping as, I quote, a form of knowledge and identification that vacillates between what is already always in place, already known, and something that must be anxiously repeated, unquote. By abstracting the Chinese portrait style into a crude caricature, Thompson dismissed the materiality of the style as well as its historical temporality. But his drawing also reveals an anxiety of facing real photographs, including those made by Miller about 12 years ago. This stereotyping of the Chinese portrait style then provided a new base for cultural dialogue and self-imagination. So when Lai Afang made a Chinese portrait for a foreigner in 1885, either based on the demand of the sitter or he introduced the idea, that's a picture now in the collection of Australia National Portrait Museum. So we can see this foreign man dressed in Chinese costume and is equipped with water pipe and also sit frontally staring into the camera, and also the props include artificial flowers on square discharge table. So strictly according to the standard image caricatured by Thompson in his report. So echoing the first generation of Chinese portraits made by Miller 24 years earlier, this new custom, we say custom portrait to the right, no longer aim to construct an authentic indigenous style, but only to consume already established indigenous style. I will end here. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So,
well, we all owe our thanks to Wu Hung for yet another incredibly intriguing paper, and I'm not going to rehearse his argument because he's done it for us in such an elegant way, and I think we see the clarity of the reasoning behind what he said, beginning with the falseness of the images that he has carefully dissected by looking closely at these photographs, and moving on to the symmetry, or rather I would say the mirror symmetry of discourse and practice among photographers working in China. The paper actually is pregnant with leads, though, and I wanted to pick up on some of these because I think they really tie this paper in a marvelous way to San Francisco, which of course is just across the bay, and there's something wonderful about the fact that this topic fits into this location in such an interesting way. The overt falseness that's seen in the models wearing costumes of different ranks is incredibly intriguing to me because it suggests, I think, well, as you've suggested, that these were meant for undiscerning Western audiences who are mostly interested in exotica and who probably wouldn't notice the incongruity of the same model wearing different rank badges. We really don't have much evidence for who constituted Miller's clientele, however, and that's what I would like to suggest as an alternative option. I wonder if what we can see here instead is Miller's attempt to create an album of possibilities for Chinese customers, much as studio photographers do even today. I think in the photograph that you showed of the row of photographers, there were pictures in the windows that were mounted as models. To use models for this purpose, I think, is not a new idea in portraiture. My good colleague Margareta Lovell is sitting right there, and when I read your paper, I immediately thought of her book, Art in a Time of Revolution, where she talks about John Singleton Copley's famous blue dress, which he seems to have kept in his studio and which was worn by Mrs. George Watson in 1765, Mrs. Daniel Hubbard in 1764, Mrs. John Amory in 1763, and Mrs. John Murray in 1763 also. So that dress got a lot of FaceTime, basically. People were looking at it all the time. It doesn't seem unusual, I think, that portraitists kept costumes in their studios. And I wonder if this is what we're looking at is actually Miller's store of potential costumes for sitters to wear. Now, I wonder, also, I was wondering to myself, what makes this elderly woman so popular? As you point out, she looks like she's had a totally miserable life. And something about purchasing a photograph like that, and, as an example of Chinese exotica, doesn't quite have the same resonance as that lovely young woman in her languid pose that you showed at us later. So I think we also need to question Miller's motives in going to Asia and also in picking up the commemorative portrait model, that is the model of the ancestral portrait. Of course, here we hit a wall fairly quickly because we don't know that much about Miller. We do know he was born in Vermont, that he studied photography in Saratoga Springs. So I have to tell you, for me, this is massively resonant. I grew up about 5 miles away. So yeah, so this is, incredible. But I was just thinking, thinking about the kind of people who live in that part of the world. And the whole idea of what happened in 1849 when the gold rush began and everyone headed to California for the main chance. I think it makes tremendous sense that Miller did that. We do know a lot more about his employer's history, I think, and that's Robert H. Vance, who set up a studio, not just one studio, but many studios in San Francisco, in fact. And he also came to employ Miller. And it seems he may also have employed Miller's brother, George Miller, who was another photographer who ultimately wound up in Idaho and became famous for photographing Native Americans. This is incredibly interesting to me because Vance's history is actually quite well known. We know that he went to Valparaiso, Chile, and set up a studio there with a partner before he came to San Francisco. So he actually went around. Yeah. So this to me is interesting. He was interested in, I think, bringing photography into different cultural contexts. And when he arrived in San Francisco, he found a city where photography was, I think, incredibly well ensconced already. There were some major pioneers working in San Francisco. Edward Muybridge, for example, was there, and there were many, many others. There were studios everywhere. And in fact, Vance's own studio was established and reestablished several times. He was constantly having fires, and I think this had to do with the very technology that was involved. So one thing that we do know about him, he had a studio on Grant Avenue, which of course is in the middle of Chinatown now, but we also know that he spent significant time in another place in California, and that is Marysville. So I think for some of you, this will have tremendous resonance. We know Marysville now is the site of one of the only remaining Chinese temples in California. And in fact, when he set up his studio in Marysville in 1853, he had his studio on D Street between 1st and 2nd Streets, which is where the Bokkai Temple is, in fact. It's right on the same, it's just on the other corner. So he was, and that was right next to the Silver Dollar Saloon, by the way. So this was a town that was loaded with people who had come from China. And I think that this is something we need to think about because Vance may well have provided some of the money for Miller to go to China to set up a studio in Hong Kong and ultimately in Guangzhou. I find this tremendously interesting because here we are in the 1850s and moving into 1860 when Miller's going to go. And what we know about the Chinese population in California during this period is something that all of you who went to high school in California will know, that the Chinese first came to the States around in the 1820s. Most of those people, all of them men, were merchants or they were students. Some of them were former sailors, and they settled in San Francisco. And it wasn't until much later in the gold rush era when hordes of people came from China, from Canton specifically, from the Pearl River Delta area, which of course was being flooded with out-migration from central China because of the Taipings beginning to rise, and same thing was happening in Shanghai. Now these Chinese didn't only come to participate in the gold rushes, we know they also came to work on the first transcontinental railway ultimately. They worked in southern plantations in the United States after the Civil War, and they also worked in setting up California's agriculture and fishery industry. So they had a vast, vast impact. But we know also that when they came mostly as men. In 1848, for example, the first wave, I think, well, it's hard to call it a wave because it was only 3 people, came from this Pearl River Delta area. And there were among them 2 men and 1 woman, and they arrived on the American brig, the Eagle. In 1850, out of a population of 4,025 Chinese in San Francisco, only 7 of them were women. So we find a population that is bereft of family, bereft of womankind. It's essentially a male population. This was the same situation in Marysville. So I'd like to suggest, from Miller's point of view, that one of the things he may have been very interested in doing is supplying Chinese immigrants who came to San Francisco during the gold rush with ancestor portraits, ones that might have been entirely fictive. They might have been. They might have claimed higher rank for their relatives than otherwise. They certainly wanted pictures of women. Most of the women who were of Chinese origin in San Francisco were prostitutes or brothel owners. So the desire for images of women from home, I think, was a really intensely felt one, too. So I'd like to suggest that perhaps Miller had, seeking the main chance again, saw a different kind of audience for photography, one that was already located here. And of course, he didn't spend much time in China. He came back rather quickly after the failure of the studio in Guangzhou. Again, it burnt down. I think this was something that happened all the time. He ultimately returned to Vermont, where there's a lovely obituary in the local paper regarding him and regarding the fact that he had amassed a fortune of $18,000, which was a huge amount of money in that period. But by the time he died, because of bad real estate deals, it was down to $8,000. So I just wanted to tell you, this sounds a lot like where I grew up as well. In any case, I think, this essential fiction of the commemorative portrait, which you point to, and it's so provocative, is incredibly interesting. The one thing that troubles me is that in the images of the men and women, the tables are on the same side. And, in commemorative portrait painting, when you have a matched husband and wife pair, they often have tables, but the tables should be on opposite sides so that the image is only complete when the two of them are hanging side by side with the tables framing. So in any case, I'd just like to suggest perhaps we could think about Miller not with the sort of, I'm not sure he really had this kind of grand image of what photography could do. It may be he had a business plan instead, and that business plan in the end didn't quite pan out for him, but he did an awfully good job of bringing it. And it's incredibly interesting to see how important this has been in developing a discourse in the West regarding Chinese photography. So I thank you very much. I had a great time thinking about early Chinese history here in California and thinking about what he might have been up to. I'm really grateful.
Thank you. It's really wonderful. You add another dimension. Just this San Francisco is more local. It's not just West. I think that's very important, right? When you talk about the East-West, often you think the East is totality. Or from the East point of view, think the West, just like enormous space, no specifics. I feel you really add a different direction. I feel it's very, very important. Just what is clientele, is it just Westerners, could be Chinese, could be other people. I think it's really worth to study more. And I also feel you're totally right to say that Miller himself, including the other photographers, I feel they just try to get money. They didn't really try to have this philosophical, aesthetic, some big ambitions. My suggestion is really as a consequence, then there's something emerged from this business or more like undertaking, eventually this kind of style. So that's sort of, I think we don't have a difference there, yeah. This little thing, actually, I don't have an answer, maybe any of you. Just this side table. Yeah. The side table, actually, this table is not a part of ancestral portrait. Ancestral portrait, usually you do not have a side table. But in the early photographs of this, you always had the side table. Mm-hmm. So the origin of this idea, this side table, to me, is still a mystery. So even in the 60s, the side table already became such a fixture. You must have a side table. Maybe put a cup or put something on it. That's just because my paper can be developed, I feel in principle the figures composition is entirely based on ancestral portrait, but it's not the side table. The side table actually represents some deviation. Yeah.
So I wonder if that's a back borrowing from photography into commemorative portraiture, because in the Freer show, they did show any number of ancestral portraits, but they had to be couples with the tables on the side. I'm wondering if those are later, perhaps.
Maybe later, even influenced by photograph, because some later, this ancestral portrait, even your face, you have a photograph there. Yeah. Otherwise, it's painted, the face very much like photographic.
Yeah. Yeah, I keep thinking of this one example from Mongolia, actually, of Dondog Dulam, who was the first empress of Mongolia in the period after the fall of the Qing. So it's quite late, actually. We're talking about a slightly later period. It's a painting, but it has her face painted en grisaille, so she looks like a photograph. She has a table, and she has the teacup, she has the clock, she has everything that's necessary. So this actually spread as a concept, I think, very far.
Also, these props, later, this time you still don't have this, what's one called, the piston? Or
spittoon.
Spittoon. Yeah. Spittoon. But later on, like around the 80s, you see the spittoon was added. Why?
I think they were chewing tobacco.
But even later, like a China Mao still have this spittoon.
It's absolutely essential. So
yes, please.
Maybe we should open the floor to questions.
Question, suggestion, or criticism, anything. Yes, please.
And thanks for Professor Berger's also very interesting questions. I'm just trying to. I was also thinking about why Miller was thinking about when he was in Hong Kong, because if you think about his being a Westerner in Hong Kong, he is both far away from his home and far away from the Chinese culture that he was exposed to in Hong Kong every day. If he wants to do something artistic, the way that he expressed himself would be to use some experience that he got in viewing the Chinese art, and also his knowledge of the Western culture together. I just feel that this might have something to do with his life world and his personal experience of getting caught in the middle of the cultures.
Actually, he's in Chinese society. There are a lot of Chinese people living in Hong Kong, right? And they did use the ancestral portrait, or they're also the expert, that kind of thing. I think when you talk about Chinese art, are you thinking about the landscape or more like traditional Chinese art? Or, right?
Ancestral portraits that you show.
Oh, yes. I think caught in between, I think maybe culturally speaking or geographically, but I feel to him he was 100% American. He never confused him with Chinese, I believe. He's a photographer, he's a businessman. He had to earn money. And what kind of product, can create profit. I feel that probably, as Professor Berger said, probably was a bigger issue than this cultural identity issue. That's my take.
Also, were these tintypes or glass plates? Were these tintypes or glass plates?
This
photographs?
This is a glass thing, yeah.
Oh. I was thinking if it were tintypes, he wouldn't have the product that would go with the person.
Didn't he lose a lot of his negatives in that Guangzhou fire?
In Guangzhou.
Or were they stolen? He put out a notice, didn't he?
He put
to
an
say-
advertisement offer, actually quite a lot of money, $300 or something, to get this thing back. So probably he lost a lot of things, maybe including the costumes that you mentioned.
Thank
Paula.
you. Hi, Wu-Hong. That was a wonderful, wonderful paper. I actually have just a little tiny question, and it may grow out of a misunderstanding that I didn't completely get, but your section on whose individuality.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say something more about what the signs of individuality were in those particular portraits, because for me, it really seemed that signs of individuality were being suppressed, if anything. So I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Interesting. Actually, this what you see is quite subjective. I feel when I say this, like this person just use him, we read a lot. Just when people talk about Miller's art and why he's so great, everybody say, he's such a very believable individual sitting in front of us, rather than this very conventional Chinese face seems all the same. So his figure seems each person, at least, is different from others, including the old lady. Just so how deep, what kind of character is hard to say, but this kind of at least separate this individual person from another individual person, including this physiognomy, like this young person, very different from middle age, the official. And I feel it's probably still on this rather rudimentary level. We are not talking about some poetic or some emotional things, because still very still. But you do feel like we say this unhappy old woman suffering. We get it from the face. You can read this unhappiness, you can create some kind of story out of there, just simply based on this face. I feel it's when you see a lot of other studio works, even from Chinese studio works, all these, prostitutes or other people look just exactly the same. It's like a flat face, has the pendant eyebrows. You don't have the volume, like this shading, like eye sockets, like the three-dimensionality. That's create quite a different feeling. I just probably. Yeah, it's closer. I feel I discussed with my colleague, like Joe Snyder. He works on American photography. We put some photographs like from 1850, 1860 American things, and together so you do see similarities, just about the modeling of the face, but quite different from the later, like Chinese studios work from even 80, 90, become increasingly flat and indistinguishable, that feeling. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if you could tell a little more about the selection of objects in interior of these spaces where these photographs were taken. Like we talked about side table, but there are also the vase, the particular type of teacup, clock, because it seems to me it also contributes to construction of particular Qing visual culture that has a diasporic spread into Mongolia, for instance, and it also spreads into figure paintings as well as photographs.
Thank you. It's a very good question about just we earlier discussed just selection of these, because there are very few. I still cannot answer why. Just why this particular teacup, why this square table. I don't really know. Definitely it was a sort of convention at the time. It seems just later you go to a photo studio, you just have something there. So definitely reflect Qing, this is like a late Qing culture. But the interesting thing to me is really in this studio, when we put these 11 portraits together, actually there are two tables, one Chinese, one Western. And the Western one is a round one. I can imagine probably some people will prefer the square one. Other people, maybe more westernized, would have the round one. So there's these choices. But I don't feel they try so hard to recreate a typical environment. Like this carpet is quite Western, just stay there. They never change the carpet. Actually, carpet is one way to identify the location of the photographs. When I have another whole group, maybe 30 portraits by Miller, basically entirely based on the carpet. The carpet is a different pattern. So you know it's from another studio, probably Shanghai studio. And style is slightly different. So I feel probably some has clear intention, but others are not. Just given it's there, so you just go to take a picture. I feel we have to give that possibility. It's not that every piece has a clear symbolic or literary or some meaning there. Some just could be just conventional. That's my feeling. Yeah. Wonderful question. Yes, can you repeat? The question is when the smile comes in. I need some help. I don't know. Like we all smile here. Why these people are so grim? Interesting. Even some very casual, like people in the garden. Miller, for example, photographed the group of these people in very casual garden. They don't really smile. I feel there are two reasons. It's probably was not the good thing or desirable thing. Another is photography then is a very slow process. You cannot move around. You cannot really make face. You have to be rather still. Actually, sometimes you have something on your back to help you, just fix you on the chair. So I feel smile, this kind of more spontaneous expression probably has something to do with the culture, maybe technology, the technique itself.
I would like to return to Professor Berger's question of consumption. Professor Wu Hong seems to suggest a colonial reading of Miller's portraits in the sense that these sitters were treated pretty much as ethnographic types and were pretty much, these portraits were created, I guess, largely for a Western clients group. But I'm wondering, like, a couple of decades later, when this tradition, when this kind of Chinese portrait photography style was inherited by the Chinese studios, by the Chinese photographers, how would you account for the composition of the clients? I mean, were they mostly Chinese then? And if so, why would they be interested in seeing Chinese portrayed as an ethnographic type?
A very complex question. We had to unpack a little bit. I feel this transformation, I feel it's a very important thing is this source of this format actually came from Chinese culture, just from ancestral portrait. So it was not from America imported one. So for the Chinese, it's very natural. Just a move from the painted one to photography. But the meaning changed quite a bit. The meaning including not just the image per se, but including who did it, for what, show, where, the location. That's all part of the meaning. So I believe pretty soon, maybe just around the same time, because they were just side by side. When Miller did such a quite a wonderful, stunning, I would say, the images, probably immediately imitated by some other people. We need the evidence, because dating photography is very difficult. Miller thing is easy because he stayed in China only 2 years, so we basically can put all the pictures in those 2 years. For many, many other Chinese products, it's very hard to date them. So I don't feel this portrait itself just convey, you say, the colonial visuality. I don't think that this image per se. Otherwise, we can say all the ancestral portrait is also colonial. No, I'm talking about this whole situation, and including this assumed clientele, but not the image. So when the Chinese already, they were very familiar with this and find, oh yeah, very grand, very official. Now, instead of a painting, we can have a portrait one. I feel that's themselves. I don't feel there's any difficulty or even a translation. Yeah.
Hi, I'd just like to add a note on the question of smiling in portraits. In point of fact, actually, the 20th century preoccupation with the convention of smiling in portraits is the exception. Certainly in the West, through most of time, the ideal portrait was not a smile, was not something that was momentary, was not either, I mean, the prescriptive literature is all about the Aristotelian mean, not to be, too brooding, and certainly not to be too gay, as they expressed it, but to be in a kind of eternal present of sort of a comfortable calm. So anyway, just to sort of interject that one point, I know nothing about the conventions of portraiture in other parts of the world, but I certainly haven't seen a lot of giggly smiles before the 20th century. I think that's something that actually our culture has invented, and it is in itself eccentric and worthy of analysis.
About the clientele, I think this we can pursue, but one thing I know pretty much, just right now, all these surviving examples of Miller's works are outside China. Mm-hmm. And I haven't found a single picture from Chinese collection. Mm-hmm. So it's really scattered in Europe, and British Library has a huge group of V&A, Salem, and Freer, and all these places. Mm-hmm. So that probably indicates really who bought those pictures, including other like Felice Beato or others. So basically, they don't exist in the Chinese photo collection. That's one thing. Another thing I think I haven't done, but if people here, students want to do, is really contextualize Miller in Hong Kong. Actually, there were other foreign photographers, like Felice Beato arrived same year, 1860, with this British-French army as a part of it. And he also made photographs and sold to the officers, including this conquest. So there were different so-called Western photographers from Europe or from America. There were probably pretty complex. Again, it's not a single word West that can encompass everything, I feel. Our understanding of early Chinese photography is very rudimentary, I think, still.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring lecture. I have one remark on the side table. Mm-hmm. At first glance, you mentioned Felix Beato in Japan. I would just think of this being, part of an element of Western photography transported into East Asian photography, because as shown in your own examples, we have these Western people leaning on something, and I remember Felix Beato had photographs where his samurai were leaning on half a column or these kind of architectural devices. But this morning I showed a portrait of a woman, which I believe was a Korean woman in the 16th century, and she had a side table with flowers on it, with a vase and lotus flowers on it. And so it's funny, because I know in Korean portraiture these things tend to change. So they became these ancestral portraits. They had a certain development, and so they became stricter later on. And I don't know. So it was puzzling to see that, to remember that also in East Asian portraiture. And my question actually is, what was the time frame for the portraiture of the imperial family in China? I remember portraits again from Japan and from Korea. King Kojong, who was photographed in Western military uniform, but also in the traditional king's dress. Yes. In photography, also painted. Yes. And I think there were similar pictures, paintings and photographies made of the Empress Zhuxi and yes, other members of the imperial family. And in terms of style, and as you explained, the impact of ancestor portraits, I wonder how the time frame was for that, and whether that also has to do with this formation of a certain idiom.
Yes. I think in China, of course, Thompson also went to, I believe, Burma or Thailand and did a lot of these royal photographs. China probably later, like Cixi. And first they published this Emperor Guangxu's portrait, actually used a foreigner as a model, and sold, it's a foreigner, and they sold like a postcard. It's not Guangxu at all, the first one. And but then soon, like Guangxu, Cixi, they picked up this because like foreign, like diplomatic officer's wife or some, they also presented them with like Queen Victoria, whatever, the portrait, so they also made portrait. I think, I don't know precise date, Cixi, those portraits are, I think, pretty late, like probably 1890s or something like that. And Cixi, I think she made one more formal one. Yeah, it's sitting in the throne with all these things and with the label, her very long name and title. But the other one I called it is more like a costume one. She disguised as this Guanyin Bodhisattva in quite a few pictures, just because she believes herself is a living Guanyin. So it's quite interesting, very theatrical, and there's props, there's the real flowers, and the eunuch also plays different kinds of parts. So Freer, actually, Washington, D.C., will have a show in December of this group of photographs. I'm looking forward to see it. We have a student, actually, Chicago, she's working on this body of materials, both Cixi's photograph and her portraits. She also has many painted portraits. She also made costumes for these particular photographs. So it's a well-planned thing. Yeah. I think there's a temporal gap between that and these. Yeah.
Before the next question, I just wanted to say we had a marvelous qualifying paper on Cixi's portraits in our department, too. Oh, really terrific, yeah.
Hi, over here. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I have a question that sort of builds on a question from across the aisle over there, but I'm very interested by the question of the captions, actually. I wonder if we could return to them momentarily. It's kind of a two-part question. First of all, looking just at what's on the screen there, a Chinese gentleman is kind of an interesting title to me because it indicates a search for equivalencies and a certain anxiety about stereotypes of what sort of people you would want to have in a collection of portraits of Chinese people. So I'd like to hear more about what you might think about, what Miller was trying to assemble in that particular collection of personages that he claimed to have photographed. And the second part of the question is more related to the subsequent style of Chinese portraiture. If you see in the later photographs or later portraits a tendency to play certain roles that are deemed proper for portraiture, This may relate to Professor Berger's comment about the consumption of ancestor portraits in overseas communities, because that would indicate that people there might desire to have a certain type of portrait, a certain type of person pictured, and maybe even think that they ought to have one to be, properly who they are. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
I think your first question is a really excellent question. I should have paid more attention. Actually, now I want to kick myself, because when I saw these pictures, I didn't really carefully note down the technique they used for these captions. And on the mat, sometimes printed, that's already is produced, sometimes handwritten. So that's quite different. I feel your question really implies, if this one is really printed, say, a Chinese gentleman, already implies the imagined customer, probably not the Chinese. I think probably that's the implication there. Or I think definitely there is also, because these are in English, again, it's very interesting. I haven't found a single one in Chinese, so it's, again, an interesting indication. But I feel that's one thing we definitely should pay attention, not just the image. But sometimes there are notes on the back, sometimes they're collected by some people. They're also framed by certain texts. That's also interesting, sometimes from a larger collection. And who own this collection, in what kind of circumstances. This Getty, this research institute, I feel is quite an interesting place, because Getty has two photography collections. One is in Getty Museum, so they pay attention to artistic quality. So they only have like a Beato and Thompson, the big names. And then the research institutes, they have been collecting basically all sorts of early photographs, many of these kinds of travelogues, books, the pasted all over photographs, a postcard with a lot of writings and many. I found that body of materials really very, very interesting, probably can answer part of this kind of question. I feel just indicate a kind of research we need to do. Not just see the images, but also study inscription, the type, other things. The second question, again, I don't feel I can answer or we can answer at this point. Just how to link this body of materials back home. But I feel, but the orientation is correct, because this, the Miller's origin and is certainly very important for us to understanding him, right? His mentality, his education, his purpose before he went to Hong Kong. So this part still is pretty murky. So I totally agree with Professor Berger. Just so we need to do some research, including the several places like San Francisco and Marysville. Though also the local population, also this. What is the clientele here first, then thinking about what is the clientele there or back home. The international trade of photography, again, is a very interesting thing. These things ship back, or just, we know very little. We really know very little. But these are very good questions, very good question. Yeah. Please, here there's a question. Yeah.
Thanks again. I don't want to take, I'm going to take this a little off the wall. The other thing that hasn't been considered or mentioned in the discussion, but from one side or the other, is that in the humidity of southern China and in the strife and the scarcity that has happened since the 1800s in that area, I would assume that even if things had been collected, the chance of survival would be a lot less than something that had been exported and brought home. I think we find this in a lot of Southeast Asian and Asian cultures where the silverfish and the molds and
yes, yes.
those things
You
kind
mean
of.
the actual photographs?
Yeah, they're even hard on the emulsion.
Yes.
So.
Could be.
That
Also,
opens,
China, there are so many
that kind
wars.
of
There's
opens
so
it up
many.
a whole other thing.
Yeah, so that's possible. Good. There are so many questions. I'm very happy about it.
So I actually have a question about the floors. So kind of going back to Orna's question about the objects in these photographs. This photograph, and as you had mentioned earlier in your introduction, most of the photographs have that rug. So it has that diamond pattern that recedes into the distance. So there's the sort of perspectival aspect to it.
The rug.
Yes. However, there's one photograph, the one that you stopped at for a while, where it was the oblique angle, where the woman, the rug below the woman is actually shows that this rug has two patterns.
Let's see.
So.
You have a very sharp eye. Let's see.
I don't. Right.
Yeah.
So you can actually see them. Then
there's a little rug put on that big rug.
Oh, is it a little rug?
Yeah.
It's two rugs.
Yeah. It's on the back. This is still the same level. Here there's a board.
Because I was thinking about the comparison to ancestor portraits and actually other portraits done much earlier than the Qing portraits where you don't really have ground, where you're either situated in space or there's no going into the picture plane. And I was wondering if, so not so much thinking about these objects as being cultural objects, but rather as being compositional or objects that direct your eyes a certain way, certain visuality. I mean,
I don't know how far we can infer from this evidence, but definitely just judging from pictures, there are few pictures among these 11. Some definitely Miller paid more attention. This one, just this double rug or this kind of interesting pose. And there's one, like that group one, like this one, the top one. It's rather elaborate. You even have this scroll on the back. You have these hot flowers, but still the same rug. This is the same space, but sort of I want to turn it into a more like an interior space, almost like a family like a room, whatever. So I feel their degree of effort. Here actually you can see that little rug too. Yeah, there's again this rug is also put here. So some pictures he just made a little bit extra effort to create like a variety, I think. Yeah.
So I think in the interest of time and in the interest of not exhausting you with
I'm not.
With our questions, we'll end here with our great thanks to you, Professor Wu Hong, and Professor Pat Berger, and the audience as well. And there's a small reception in the back with the leftovers from the reception from the beginning of the event. And thank you very much for coming, and thank you for a wonderful talk.
Enjoy it.